Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 6, Episode 18, presented by Marketile. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
In this episode, our second interview of several recorded live in our pop-up studio in Barcelona at the World Retail Congress. Our very special guest is a fellow Rethink Retail top, a retail influencer, and top global expert in consumer centricity, London-based Martin Newman.
Yeah, I finally got to meet Martin after feeling like I knew him via social media for many years. Finally got to meet him at the NRF, and we compared notes on the exciting world of customer centricity, and it was great to be able to get him on the mic to get some of his wisdom from his many years in the area.
Now, you're just back. You're a little jet-lagged, you were telling me off mic. You're just back from Shop Talk Europe and an extended European boondoggle. Tell us about your session on the stage and your assessment of the show.
Oh, it was good. I wish I could have been there longer. I think, as I may have mentioned last week, I was doing a speech for a retailer's internal event in Denmark, so that kind of cut into my Shop Talk time. I got into not only how technology is being used to improve efficiency and effectiveness, but also things about, how difficult it is to find employees and retain them, and kind of covered a landscape. One of the things that was really fun to do is we use this voting technology. So we asked the audience questions about their attitudes towards certain statements. We had 4 of those questions. And so we got those in real time. So it was a great way to engage the audience, kind of take their temperature. And then we talked about, whether they were surprised by that finding and kind of how they're dealing with it. So I was really pleased with it, and we had a good time and a good turnout.
Let's get to the news. That's right. We've got the Wobbly Unicorn soundtrack already. This is almost going to be the Wobbly Unicorn episode because the Wobbly Unicorns are getting wobblier.
Yeah.
My goodness. Lots of news. Yeah. So let's, let's start with Peloton, for example. Let's just start there.
Well, this is a real quick one. But yes, we have a bunch of news because we had a lot of earnings reports this past week from some of these disruptor brands. And let's just say in total, it was kind of a shit show, to use the technical term. Before we get to the earnings, just a quick hit, because we talked about Peloton's earnings last week or the week before. But the hits just keep on coming for Peloton. They announced a massive recall. 2 million bikes have to come back because of some issue with, I think, a seating mechanism or
I didn't even know they sold 2 million bikes, but there you go.
Yes. So
like every bike plus loaners.
Yeah. So that seems like a pretty expensive issue coming at a time where they could really use some good news. So unfortunately, that happened as they're trying to do a relaunch and rebranding. So not great news for them. But to get into the actual earnings, the first one to talk about, which we've talked about multiple times, is the continuing train wreck that is Allbirds. They reported net revenue down 13%, which is quite a lot for a brand that is allegedly growing. They lost $35 million, which I think is like 60% operating margin, negative operating margin. That's twice as much money as they lost last year, roughly. And their SG&A is 79% of revenue.
Wow.
That's after some layoffs. So, but they're really getting deleveraged because their revenue is going in the other direction. So that's not so awesome.
Sure.
They've been run by 2 CEOs, founders, and they're now going to have one of them who's going to be like chief innovation officer or something like that. So that'll leave Joey Zwillinger, I'm sure I'm butchering his last name, as the sole CEO. Joey is a guy that you will recall we got to see beaming in to the World Retail Congress for an interview where he got asked absolutely no questions about the business. It was a lot of good stuff, I guess, in terms of the sustainability effort they have. Yeah. But kind of buried the lead, I would say, as we say in the journalism biz, in terms of how difficult the business or how poor the business is performing. And then to make matters worse, which is already pretty bad, they're being sued because it's a shareholder lawsuit claiming that Allbirds failed to disclose that they were working on products outside of their core product. And that basically was enticing investors into the stock, thinking that, their core business was really the place they were investing. And then they got distracted, which at least what the lawsuit claims is that caused them to have a lot of markdowns and all this other kind of stuff, which caused the stock to tank. So that's not too awesome.
Other than that, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln kind of comment?
Yeah.
There's a lot going sideways. Now, Joey did say, he did kind of admit to this was a lot harder than we thought it would be in some parts of that interview.
The master of understatement.
Master of understatement. Well, anyway, we wish them better days.
Yes. They got a lot of work to do.
Let's talk about Wayfair. Again, another organization we've talked about quite frequently. Sometimes we are baffled, if I could put another consulting phrase to it. But what was your observation about their numbers?
Well, in some ways, it wasn't as bad as it has been the last couple of quarters. The revenues were down only about 7%. Their active customer total, though, they were down, customer count was down almost 15% year over year. So that's not great. On a GAAP basis, and this is where some of the losses, in terms of standard accounting principles versus cash flow, et cetera, there's sometimes a divergence, but they managed to lose $355 million in one quarter. That's quite a lot.
That's quite an accomplishment. Yeah.
Negative cash flow, $234 million. But speaking about master of understatement, their CEO started out their earnings release by saying this was a strong quarter for Wayfair. I'm not sure what universe he's living in, but in that they didn't file for bankruptcy, I guess. Strong quarter. But speaking of bankruptcy,
phones are still working in the headquarters, I guess.
Yeah, they are now on the Fitch Ratings does assessments of bankruptcy risk. So Wayfair is now on that list. So that's not so great. But Wayfair is going to try, because their balance sheet, if they continue to have several $100 million go out the door every quarter, their balance sheet is weakening quite a lot. They have some debt coming due. And so they're going to do a debt issue, or they're going to try to raise, $677 million to kind of refinance themselves at an interest rate of 3.5%. I can't quite understand why anybody
that doesn't seem like
the debt at 3.5% when you can get close to 5% in a savings account. Seems like this is a little bit riskier bet.
Yeah.
So I don't know. This is not exactly my expertise, but that seems like a stretch.
Who was it? You used this phrase last episode about having to run into somebody else's arms when you get into too much trouble. Do you see a potential of somebody picking up Wayfair in the days or months or years to come? I've always thought there was a couple of big players who could leverage that, cut down the SG&A and all those expenses and right size the business and take advantage of what they've built in some way. Is that possible? Or do you think they'll?
It's possible. I think at the moment
in this environment, I guess it's a
tough environment to do a deal like this. The stocks come down a lot, so it's a lot more affordable in theory, but it's still a multi-billion-dollar deal under, I think, any circumstances. And so I think the list of possibilities is kind of Walmart, Amazon, end of list, I think. But I don't know. Maybe I'm not thinking as holistically as I should about that. But my guess is there isn't a deal to be done, at least in the next bit here. But who knows? And then the one I would say, which is much better news, but still not awesome, was Warby Parker. They had pretty strong sales growth, up 12%. Their active customer growth was not super robust, but was also positive. They cut their net loss from $34 million last year to about $11 million. So that's definitely going in the right direction.
Yeah.
They have a much better balance sheet. They are hemorrhaging a lot less cash, still cash outflow, but quite modest. So I would not be worried about them in particular. The thing I thought was interesting, and I think in the past I've mentioned I'm a little bit skeptical that their store expansion strategy is going as well as they seem to indicate. But they have said quite recently that they intend to go from, I think it's 207 stores now that they have open, to as many as 900 stores. But what was interesting, two things were interesting, is in the quarter, they only opened net 4 stores. And at that rate, it's going to take a long time to add 700 stores to the store count. So maybe there's something about the quarter that made it, I guess, kind of weird. But you think if you're on the trend to 900 stores, you'd be opening 30, 40, 50 a quarter.
Sure.
But anyway,
sure.
The other thing, and I may be just reading too much in the past several quarters, they've talked about how their stores are performing relative to the pro forma. And there was no detail on that this time. Now, it just maybe they had plenty of other things to talk about, but kind of looking at the tepid store opening pace along with no detail on that, I think maybe they're going a bit more cautiously. And that may just be a function of the economy, that they're kind of tapping the brakes a little bit just to see how things are going to go. So that may be, a really savvy strategy for the next year. It doesn't necessarily mean that this business is, not on a robust path.
Yeah, and I was a little taken back by them saying, hey, we could go to 900 stores, because you'd want some kind of evidence that you have any trajectory to get to that number, which I don't see, to your point. So that's what jumped out at me is like, why would you even say something like that? Because it's demonstrably not happening. I don't know.
At least not so far. And, if you look at Casper made a similar statement and, they're falling a little bit short of that goal.
Hey, listen, there's a long list of people who made that statement. I mean, you go back to Amazon talking about, or whether whoever talked about, we're going to 3,000 stores for Amazon Go. And, they got 6 now or whatever it is left.
Yeah, right.
Let's talk about Walmart. So some big news at the personnel level. And of course, Walmart is scale and size and scope. People, we don't always talk about people moves, but this is a pretty important one.
Yeah, well, they named Latrice Watkins as their chief merchant, which of course is a huge job. It's kind of hard to even get your head around what it's like to be the EVP and chief merchant at Walmart. She's kind of a lifer, I guess, at Walmart. She's been there for more than 20 years. She was the executive vice president over consumables, which is one of their big categories, and for the U.S. business. But I think what's particularly significant about it is she's the first woman and first person of color to hold the top merchant job at Walmart. So I think that is excellent progress. I do not know her personally. I know quite a few people at Walmart who say really wonderful things about her. So I just wanted to kind of lift that up.
Let's talk about last couple of things. Let's talk about this. There's an article in The Atlantic about the returns party being over. And we're starting to see this pop up in media about pay for returns, less willingness to take returns. Any thoughts on that article, the return party being over? Is this just the natural course of things? When the economy gets tighter, people get a little less forgiving around returns. And what do you think?
I think the thing I wanted to include, I mean, we've talked about returns multiple times on the podcast. I wrote an article for Forbes years ago about the ticking time bomb of e-commerce returns. So this is not a new issue at all, but it does feel like something has changed in the, if we could say, the retail zeitgeist, and that's really what the article points out, is that as much as people have been watching this issue for many, many years, and there's been a lot of discussion about it, retailers seem to really be starting to change their policy in a significant way. They quote some statistics about the percentage of retailers that now charge for returns going up quite a lot. So it does seem like the tide is really turning here. There's still certainly a long way to go.
You see what I did there? Not returning. You see what I did there?
Yes. So it's certainly, there's a long way to go in terms of really making progress on this issue. It's probably, I think where you were alluding, that the tough economy is probably putting more pressure on it. But I think this pressure's been building. I know this pressure's been building for a number of years, and maybe it just took enough, like this critical mass or tipping point, to use the overused phrase, has finally occurred.
You don't often say the words baffling and Amazon in the same sentence, but I'm going to use it a little bit in this sentence. The company is encouraging their consumers to say, pick stuff up from their pickup locations, and there's a $10 promotion to make them do it. So are they walking away from, are they walking back the whole delivered to doorstep in a meaningful way? Or what is this? Is this then just trying something different?
Yeah, so supposedly this is something, according to the company, they have been testing for a while. Reuters picked up the news that they are encouraging customers not to have their orders delivered, but giving them a $10 promotion to go pick the orders up from pickup locations. Now, you might recall, I think it was last week when we talked about Amazon's earnings, that one of the things I pointed out is that their fulfillment costs continue to grow at a much faster rate than sales. And this is actually, I haven't looked at it every quarter, but this has been a long-term trend for Amazon. And so this idea of how you can reduce costs in your fulfillment system has been something that's a concern at Amazon for a long time. So it's not surprising to me that they're trying ways to change that. Now, I do think it's funny that the company was quoted as saying they're not doing this as a way to cut costs. And that just seems like nonsense. Like I can't, there doesn't seem to be any other reason that you would pay somebody $10 to go get something if, it's not a benefit to the customer necessarily that you would have to bribe them to do it. So
I would do that. Would you do that for $10? I mean, I've got a pickup location not far away. For $10, I'd swing by and do it. Would you?
Yeah, I mean, it would depend on how busy I am or where I was going, but I'm aware of where the closest Amazon locker is, and it's not far. And if I were headed in that direction, it would be easy enough to do it.
All right. Well, lots of news to catch up on. So that was great. Now, just before we get to our great interview with Martin Newman, recorded live in person at the World Retail Congress, let's hear from our presenting sponsor. If you're a retailer hungry for a better way to gain useful insight on the impacts of your store layout, design, and strategic initiatives, you need to know Marketile. Marketile is an easy-to-use testing platform that emboldens great decisions, leading to reliable, scalable results. With Marketile, you can be confident in the outcome of your in-store pilot initiatives before rolling them out across your fleet. Validate your remarkable ideas with Marketile's in-store testing solution. The proof is in the testing. Learn more at Marketile.com. That's Marketile.com.
Well, Martin Newman, we meet again.
We do.
Last time I saw you was at another conference in a different part of the world, but welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast. How are you today, sir?
I am great. Thank you for having me. I'm really good.
Well, we're delighted to have you here. So just to kind of kick things off, we usually like to give our listeners a little bit of a sense of who we're talking to. So maybe you could share a little bit about your personal and professional journey and the work you do and what brings you to Barcelona.
Sure. Despite my youthful look, Steve, I'm 57 years of age. So I've been working for a whole 41 years. I went straight out of university, Freudian slip, straight out of school into my father's business. He wished I'd gone to university, but unfortunately that wasn't my calling at that stage in life. I didn't really know what I was wanting to do in my career. But I did go and work for him, and he had a chain of opticians in Glasgow, in the west of Scotland, and I cut my teeth on the shop floor, customer experience, customer service, and marketing. So it was back in the days when no such thing as a CRM solution existed. We had a roller deck of patient records that I was flying through every day, looking at who needs to get their eyes tested because they haven't had their eyes tested in the last couple of years. But my father, when he was sadly no longer alive, my father was not just a great optician, he was a great human being and amazing at engaging with patients and customers. And, they would come in looking to get their eyes tested, and they'd walk out with 2 pairs of glasses and a pair of sunglasses, which if you've ever been to the west of Scotland, you would know you don't really have too much need for a pair of sunglasses. And I guess I got that passion. And some of that expertise from my father, and it's led me to where I am today. Give you a snapshot of my career. I've been a marketing director for a couple of big sports retailers in Europe. I got involved in the old internet in 1997. So I was
that's going to be big.
It's quite allegedly. Not as big as the metaverse, though.
Don't get us started.
Exactly. So I got involved quite early, and I actually spent about $100,000 building an e-commerce site for one of the sports retailers I was working for. I convinced my boss we were going to get all this new customer base and demand and everything, and about 6 months later I don't think we'd sold a single thing, because of course it was all dial-up modem. Broadband wasn't really a thing. It was such a terrible experience. Nobody bought anything, and as you know what happened after that. But I saw the opportunity and I thought, well, if I need a website, everyone's going to need a website. I'm going to build websites. So I had a go at my first business in 1998, and I set up a web development company, and we were building a combination of brochureware sites and e-commerce sites, and did really well for about 2.5 years. Made quite a bit of money, and then sadly had to pull the plug in the business, because when the .com boomed and then busted in sort of 2000, 2001, software as a service there wasn't really such a thing at that time. It didn't really exist, and so I didn't have recurring revenue. I was selling, a one-off project, getting quite a lot of money for it, either putting it in the bank or some cases spending it, not realizing that this was going to be an impending doom and gloom that was coming down the track. And when I pulled the plug in the business, being completely candid, I lost my confidence. I thought, okay, I'm not an entrepreneur. I've tried that one. I'm not fit for purpose. I'm going back to a career. And I started looking for jobs in London because retail at that time in Glasgow and Scotland, there wasn't an awful lot of opportunity anymore. A lot of the big companies had moved out and moved their head offices elsewhere. And eventually I landed a role at Harrods, the big corner shop, the big department store, and I came down to be their head of home shopping. So I ran catalogues and e-commerce. And I went through a succession of high-profile roles. First of all at Harrods, then at Pentland Brands, who are a multi-brand owner. They own Speedo and many other brands.
And just for the listeners, what year abouts was that?
Yeah, so I came to Harrods in 2004.
Okay.
I was at Pentland end of 2005 to part of 2006. I was Burberry's first head of online in Europe in the latter part of 2006, and then I went to Ted Baker in 2007. So I had some short-lived roles. But I got to the end of 4 back-to-back roles being head of online, and I thought to myself, crikey, I'm P&L responsible. In other words, my bonus, my job, my tenure rests on my ability to deliver a number that somebody else has concocted, not me. But ultimately, lots of other people were making all the big decisions that affected my ability to deliver that number. So I thought, I need to maybe try doing my own thing again. But before I did that, I moved to a sort of consulting business. Actually, they were a hybrid, a consultancy and an agency called Conchango. They sold their company halfway through my notice period at Ted Baker. I got made redundant. Last one in, first one out, big ticket and all the rest of it. And I thought to myself, I've worked with lots of consultants in my career where the McKinseys, the Accentures have been brought into businesses. And they've all got the same model. And it's changed now. I know they look more for industry expertise now, but back then they had a model where they would hire the brightest people from the best colleges, schools and universities. Yeah. Super bright people.
One senior partner, a lot of young,
sharp
people.
But they had no real world experience. And I thought there must be a gap in the market for a business, an advisory business that's made up of people like me who have been there, done it, and know what works and know what doesn't work. And so I set up a business called Practicology. Hence the emphasis on the practical experience. And I grew that consultancy from me to 100 people over 9 years.
Wow.
No investment, bootstrapped it, which I wouldn't necessarily advise anyone else try to do because it was pretty difficult. And had I not had the experience of a business failure before, I would have probably gone bust about half a dozen times. But I saw the writing on the walls in time with the experience I had before, and I was always able to pivot and take corrective actions at the right moment. And we scaled the business. We had offices in London, Dubai, Hong Kong, Guangzhou in China, and Sydney and Melbourne in Australia. I'm fluent in Australian, having been there 26 times. And we sold the business in 2018. We had a good luck moment. We sold to an American company called Pattern, who are an amazing business, now the number one reseller globally on Amazon. And with a bit of luck as a shareholder in that business, somewhere down the line, that might result in part of my retirement fund. Who knows? But I set about. I've still got a great relationship with the founder of the business and all the people that are left there. And I've moved on. And what I do today is I've got sort of 3 buckets of activity. So I'm a board advisor. I've got a number of board advisory roles. I do what I call media, where I turn up at events like the World Retail Congress and either do a keynote or moderate a panel or something along those lines, which I've just done today, the panel. And then I have education. And like you, Steve, I've got a couple of books. I've got a mini MBA in customer-centricity, which I created with a college in Oxford. And I've just also agreed to be a visiting lecturer at Strathclyde University's Business School in Scotland.
Nice.
And I promise you when I tell you, my teachers will be turning in their graves at the prospect of me delivering any form of education to anybody else.
There you go.
Well, that's quite a journey. So as I understand it, I think when I first ran into some of your work, and I know you've done a lot of different things, the through line seems often to be around this concept of customer centricity or being customer first.
Totally.
Those all sound like nice things.
Yeah.
What do you mean
Sure.
by that? And then we'll kind of maybe go a little bit
Thank
deeper.
you for asking that question, because that really is why I wrote my first book, 100 Practical Ways to Improve Customer Experience, because I realized one day I was having a session with my team at Practicology, and I said, we've got to help our clients become more customer centric. Right? What does that entail? And I looked around the room and I saw about 40 blank expressions. And I thought, oh, crikey, I've got a problem here. I better go and work out some kind of framework for what it is. So for me, it actually starts with being employee-centric. It starts with actually thinking about your own people, because I really believe that too many businesses out there don't do that well enough, don't care or look after their own people well enough, create opportunities to learn and develop.
They all say they do.
They say they do, but they don't in reality, or create succession plans and show people that they can have a long-term career there. Create a culture of empowerment where people are, are trusted to make decisions without always having to ask for permission,
right.
Which, as we know, fosters a very different experience for them, how they feel about working in that environment when they're trusted to make decisions. But it also changes what happens to the customer, right? When you're empowered to make a decision without having to ask 10 people for permission. So that's my first building block. Obviously, technology is core, but I never start with technology. And I've made mistakes in my career, no doubt about it, where when I was wanting to be seen as an early adopter and an innovator when I was on the client side, I would bring in a solution without necessarily really thinking through all the time, what's the problem I'm actually trying to solve for customers in the first place.
Right.
So I think at the heart of when I'm thinking about, customer centricity, it actually starts with giving my colleagues or the employees a voice and listening to them and what they think about what the business should be doing, and then giving the customers a voice. I think we often talk about the latter, but we don't often talk about the former. And a very good friend of mine, a guy called Mike Logue, who's one of the best CEOs I've ever had experience of working with in the UK. He ran a business called Dreams who do mattresses, beds and bedding. And he inherited the business in 2013. He was working with Sun Capital, who are a private equity turnaround specialists you probably know. When they bought the business, it was losing 50 million quid a year, let's say $60 million a year. And within a couple of years, they turned it around and it was making 50 million a year. And in 2019, 2020, they sold the business for, I think, about 600 million to Tempur Sealy. And the first thing that Mike did in his first 6 weeks is he basically went round every single store in the UK. He went and spoke to customers. He went and spoke to as many colleagues as he could have a conversation with, because he wanted to know firsthand what was going wrong, what was broken in the business. He knew he wasn't going to get that necessarily from data. He was going to get that from qualitative conversations with as many colleagues and customers as he could talk to. And off the back of that, he created a sort of listening tool called Pillow Talk, which is essentially where they run a survey of customers, whether they bought something or not. And they get, believe it or not, them incredible engagement. 40% of consumers fill this out every day. They have a prize or reward, but at the end of the day, people don't do it for that. They do it because they want to share their experience. And he takes that insight, or he's no longer there, but he would take that insight and he would make sure that every single meeting in the business started with insight rather than finger in the air, because it really told him what wasn't working and what needed to be fixed or repaired. So for me, listening to customers, listening to colleagues is really important. Providing a great culture and the right environment for your own colleagues to thrive and do the best job that they can. Technology. So technology is an enabler, right? And what I always say with technology is we tend to overestimate the impact of technology in the short term, but massively underestimate its impact in the long term.
So
those are just some of my building blocks.
No, those are excellent. And, one of the things, and this is just, I guess, being a cranky old man, but, I've been around long enough to have participated in any number of customer-centric, customer-first. We put the customer at the center of everything we do. Yeah. Having an empty chair at the conference table representing the customer. Yeah. You name it.
Yeah. That's my favorite.
And I recently heard, and I won't say whom, but a CEO in their investor presentation lead with, we are going to become customer-centric, as if he could spontaneously combust fire or nuclear power or something.
Yes.
So customer centricity sounds like a really great idea. People have talked about it forever.
Yeah.
Why, from your experience, is it so hard for people to get from
A to
saying
B
it
to doing it?
to doing it?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it's down to the fact that actually the definition of it's a bit like omni-channel or digital transformation. If you ask 100 people in 100 businesses what either of those terms mean, you'll get 10,000 different answers, right? So if everyone's got a different view of what customer centricity is, and there isn't a North Star that everybody has
Sometimes
clarity.
it's like customer service, right?
Yeah.
Right, that's...
Yeah, you might think it's customer service. You might think it's just about the contact center.
Right.
You might think it's purely about customer experience, about the bits that touch the customer.
Yeah.
But it's not so much broader than that. So what I would, if I was going to round out when I was talking about my framework, it's also about diversity and inclusion. If your business, for example, if your board of directors is pale, male and stale, if your senior leadership team is pale, male and stale, if the masses in your business don't represent the customers that you're trying to effectively sell to and serve, then how are you possibly going to do the best job that you can when you're not really representative of the people you're selling to?
Great point.
So I think all these things, are increasingly important to customers, but businesses maybe don't have that framework or that visibility of all the different building blocks and how to stitch them together. But I would start with a North Star. If you start with a North Star and the North Star could be, and sorry to say this, but the North Star could be, we are going to be the most customer-centric business in our space. But what you've got to do after that is obviously then take the next step. And the next step for me would be every single part of an organization, every single person and every single part of an organization can have an objective and some form of measurement that relates to that North Star of being truly customer-centric. Because whether you're facing the customer, you're directly yourself in a store, in a contact center, or whatever it happens to be, or whether you're a facilitator and a provider for other people in the business that are, i.e. you look after supply chain or you look after finance, you're making decisions that affect the ability of your colleagues to deliver the experience that your customers are looking for. So everyone can have some form of measurement there. So that's a starting point, because if you don't do that, then no one is going to buy in to this North Star. No one's going to buy into this big strategic nirvana to be truly customer-centric or the most customer-centric brand in their space. What they're going to be focusing in on is my tenure and my bonus rely on my ability to deliver the OKRs or the KPIs that relate to my part of the business. And that's all I care about. That's all I give a toss about. I don't care about what happens elsewhere, because that affects me directly. So I don't think we create an environment that fosters customer centricity from the get-go. So I think we have to know what it means. We have to understand how to join it up. But we have to start measuring people in some shape or form and tell them what their role is going to be in helping the organisation to deliver it.
You've unpacked really well both the challenge and the opportunity, shall we say, about being customer-focused, and you've spoken on it frequently. What are the kind of 2 or 3 just really key things organizations need to do, if you can boil it down, to be really effective at being a great customer experience organization?
Sure. I think the first thing you have to do is you have to listen to your customers and you have to listen to your colleagues. If you don't give them a voice, then you don't understand the problem that you need to solve for both of them. And if you don't have a truly engaged workforce who think you've got a thriving culture and they want to spend the rest of their lives working for you, then you're always going to have a lot of disruption within your own business, and they're not going to go the extra mile to deliver the experience that your customers are looking for. And if you're not listening to your customers, then the chances are you don't really understand them. You don't really understand what their pain points are or the problems that they want resolved, and therefore you're probably going to end up making investments in the wrong areas. So for me, that's the starting point. When it comes to implementation, you've got to have support from the top within the business. Culture comes from the top. You need to either have a leader who is going to unblock the roads and the path for others to deliver customer centricity. So that could be your CEO, or you need to have a chief customer officer or someone who has the responsibility for not only defining what this new roadmap looks like, but is also empowered to drive change and transformation throughout the business. Because otherwise, when I was head of
incented to do so.
And incented to do so.
Back to your
100%.
point. Right.
So when I worked on the client side, and I worked for Harrods and Ted Baker and Burberry and brands like that, and I went to the chief technology officer, and I said to her or him, I've got this, I'm empowered by the board, I've got this mandate to drive a more customer-centric experience across the business, and we've got all these new initiatives that we want to implement. He or she would say to me, sure, Martin, I really buy into that. You can have all of that 5 years on Friday, because I've already got a roadmap the length of my arm and a backlog of all the things that I've got to focus on. So who's empowered to say to that person, you need to reprioritize that backlog, because this is now your new set of priorities.
Yeah.
And when I talk about technology, technology is very it can be very complicated, but I think we overcomplicate it. As I said earlier, I think if we understand the problems we're trying to solve, and if we start with empowerment, if empowerment is the theme, if we empower our customers to have the experience they want to have, and we empower our colleagues to do the best job they can, then we know we're on to a winner. Then a lot of other things are going to be superfluous. So the rest of the stuff that's in your backlog almost becomes irrelevant to some extent.
It's a really great point, because, it's not like anyone arrives at an organization and the organization has a zero blank slate. We're not working on anything right now.
Yeah.
I mean, there has to be a change and a change agent.
Totally.
Speaking of change, anything, we talked about the COVID year, the long short-term implications of the COVID year. And do you think anything has changed in the way you think about the work you do or customer experience because of what we've
Not massively, to tell you the honest truth. I mean, I just ran a panel session there on, what's next for e-commerce, and I started by making a point that, a bit like we get so media hyped up. Interesting listening to Professor Galloway this morning, and he talked about that, and we get so... the media has a lot to answer for, because you get all this media hype about, the high street's dead, the high street's dead. I spent years defending the high street and saying, well, a load of rubbish, it's not going anywhere.
Back to the retail apocalypse.
The majority,
right?
exactly. The majority of sales were taking place still at that time on the store. And then, of course, you have stores being shut in the middle of the pandemic, and all of a sudden, it's no surprise that online sales spike. But I knew when stores opened, it was going to go back the other way. But the point to make is, as we are sitting here today in the UK, now 26% of all retail sales are online. That is still nearly 50% up on where it was prior to the pandemic.
Ordered online.
Ordered online. Yes, of course.
Ordered
It's a good point. Good point.
Yeah.
Point of order there from Steve. It's a good point. Yeah, ordered online. And of course, some of that will be click and collects. But the reality is, e-commerce is not going away. So, we've gone from the high street's dead to... We've had 10 years of digital transformation in a few months to it's only about e-commerce now to e-commerce is dead. We're back to the high street in the physical world.
To why are we even making the distinction between e-commerce and physical stores?
Exactly.
And I often point out the inverse math, right? So that means 74% of retail, depending on how you define it, was done in the way it's been done.
I was told there would be no math. But
Exactly. It's not my strong point. Not my strong point. No, you're 100% right, Michael. Absolutely. So I think we're too quick to latch on to some of these short-term, micro moments or macro moments of change that aren't necessarily permanent. I think a lot of things are going to go back to the way they were, but obviously the level of digital change and disruption and the adoption of e-commerce has seen a lot of people who never used to shop online before shopping online.
Right.
And getting very comfortable with shopping online. Or the frequency of purchasing online has definitely increased a bit. But the reality is, when you cage human beings up, what are we going to do? We're going to want to get back into stores. We're going to want to get out there, be entertained, be in the real world and the physical world. But after time, things go back to the way they were. I'm a firm believer that everything in life is largely secular. You can go back 100 years and you can see similar patterns when we had the Great War, and then you had the flu pandemic, and then you had the boom of the 20s, and then you had the Great Depression, then you had the Second World War. And if you look at what's happening with politics and everything else, we're in an interesting and challenging time. And of course, we've got the cost of living crisis at the moment to contend with, which is worse in different markets like our little island of the UK. It's a lot worse than I think
Scott had a lot to say about that.
He had a lot to say on that.
Now being a fellow resident, apparently.
So one of the things I think is interesting, I'm curious your perspective. I feel like a lot of the mistaken narratives, aside from just the clickbait nature of digital media, are often what I would say are driven by kind of the left brain thinking, like the logic of why wouldn't you shop on, some people will be like, why wouldn't you shop online? because that's just the logical thing to do. And the way I can calculate what the impact of e-commerce will be is just kind of fun with math. But if you actually understood, if you had more higher EQ, and you actually understood the emotional drivers of a lot of purchasing, like if you had the capacity to understand that, you would at least mitigate or moderate, I guess, your view of what was likely to happen. Like, so I feel like when we talk about customer centricity, it can be this blend, or part of it, it can be this blend of art and science. That's part of the hard part of piecing things together and figuring out where things are going. Is that part of your thought process?
I would agree with that, but I think actually, you talked about emotion or emotive, responses, and I think that's really key for me. And I think that what's happened with a lot of retail in the last 50 years is it's increasingly lost, because 50 years ago retail was much more localized. We didn't have a lot of the big national chains, or the big national chains were a lot smaller, and the experience was a lot more localized. And what a lot of retailers have done is they've empowered their head offices to make all the big decisions, and they've taken the power away from the people who are running the stores in the local area. And I don't understand that at all, because surely somebody that's in Denver, Colorado is better placed to dictate how they should be merchandising their store or what the best-selling products are compared to somebody sitting in a head office in Miami who's living in a different climate. And yes, they might be looking at data, but I think when you're on the ground and you can see things firsthand, I think you get a different perspective. The other thing I would say is that every single business can start the process of turning a customer into a fan. I don't care what you sell. I don't care whether you sell dodgy, frilly shirts or flowered shirts, or whether you sell multicolored glasses, or whether you sell widgets, or whether you sell laptops, or whether you sell check shirts, Steve. Or black glasses that we're both wearing, or books. I don't care what you sell. Everyone can start the journey of turning a customer into a fan. It's the process that you go through of doing that, where you deal with customers differently, that starts to change them from feeling that all you're interested in is their money, and it's a transactional relationship to something that actually has a bit of depth to it, where it becomes more about the relationship, and where they start to build up some degree of emotional connection with your brand. And I think once you've done that and you can build on that, then you're really in a really amazing space. And when we're talking about channels, for me, it's all about turning up where your customers want you to be. And the reality is, and one of the reasons why obviously our internet pure play businesses are finding things a bit tough at the minute, is they've gone from spiking like mad and the best performance they've ever had during the pandemic to all of a sudden their sales are flat, or in some cases in decline. And where the advantage our multi-channel retailers have got is it's taken them longer to maybe evolve and mature their digital operations. But now they've got a pretty good digital, proposition and e-commerce proposition. But of course, consumers are over-indexing going back to their stores. And if you can join all that together, and you can have a single view of the customer, and you can start to deliver the type of experience that customers really want, and you understand what that looks like because you've listened to them in the first place, and you've understood the problems that they want resolved, then you're onto a winner.
Well, I love that. So one quick closing question before we lose you. Is there anything that's on your radar screen that you think maybe is underappreciated, or retailers aren't paying enough attention to right now we haven't talked about?
I'm going to talk, I've kind of...
And if you say metaverse, you're kicked off.
I'm not going to talk about the metaverse, Steve. We have talked about the circular economy briefly. I want to talk about the circular economy, and I want to talk about diversity and inclusion. And the reason why I want to talk about those two subjects is, like you, I've sat on a number of boards, and I can tell you from my own experience that if you go back 5 or 10 years ago, I would say that most boards were paying lip service to these things, and they saw them only as a cost and not as a benefit. I'd say where we are today is they now recognise that they're morally imperatives. They're moral imperatives and morally the right thing that they should be doing and focusing on. However, I still don't think they really understand necessarily the commercial opportunity by being a truly diverse and inclusive business that's representative of the customers that you're selling to, and a business that proves it's not just talking the talk, but it's walking the talk on sustainability. And from a consumer point of view, we are all racked with guilt about what we buy, from whom we buy it, and what the impact of that is. I really believe that. I don't care what anyone says about younger Gen Zs not caring about it and still buying fast fashion. I've got 2 Gen Zs at home. Everyone has guilt about conscious consumption, what we buy and what the impact of it is going to be on the planet and the future of our children and our children's children. So anything a retailer can do to help mitigate that risk and give us more insight and more ability, whether that's through the circular economy or whether that's bringing in our old products, donating old products to people who can't afford to buy those products in the first place, or buying recycled products or renting instead of buying a brand new product, those brands are going to be helping us mitigate our risk. And every study you look at of businesses who are diverse and inclusive, or who really focus and understand the implications of sustainability to consumers, particularly given that Gen Z's the younger generation of the future of our business, if you can do those two things right, I guarantee you'll be successful both now and in the future.
Excellent. Well, that's a great place to leave it. Martin Newman, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Cheers, Steve. Thanks, Michael.
If you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, your favorite podcast platform, so you can catch up with all our great interviews, including Judith McKenna, President, International, Walmart. New episodes of Season 6, presented by our friends at Market Dial, will show up each and every Tuesday. And be sure and tell your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us.
And I'm Steve Dennis, author of the best-selling book, Remarkable Retail: How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant, keynote speaker, and producer, and host of a series of retail trade podcasts, including this one. You can learn even more about me on LinkedIn. You can catch up with me on the stage at Store Conference in Toronto, May 31st. And you can see both of us at the Lead Innovation Summit in July, live on stage in New York with our friend of the pod, Simeon Siegel from BMO. Until then, safe travels, everyone.